This presentation is based from the 8th chapter of Mishkin's book, The Economics of Money, Banking, and Financial Markets. This chapter will focus on giving an economic analysis of financial structure. The main learning objectives of this presentation will be to identify the 8 basic facts about the global financial system, summarize how transaction costs affect financial intermediaries, recognize the principal agent problem arising from moral hazard in equity contracts, and also summarize the methods for reducing moral hazards in equity contracts. The next slide will present a graph of the external funding received by the US, Germany, Japan, and Canada, and where this funding came from. The data will present from the year 1970 to the year 2000. This graph details the sources of external funds received for non-financial businesses around the world. The bar chart shows the different methods of external funding, namely bank loans, non-bank loans, bonds, and stocks. And it shows what percent of that method can be contributed to a certain country's total external funding. This chapter provides an economic analysis of how our financial structure is designed to promote economic efficiency. Most Americans have heard of or have basic information about the stock market. The media puts an extra focus on the stock market and its daily performance. Because of this constant talk about the stock market, we must assume the stock market is the highest and most important source of funding for American corporations, right? While the stock market is important to funding American corporations, from the year 1970 to the year 2000, the stock market only accounted for 11% of external funding for American businesses. According to the same data, other countries saw similar percentages. In Japan, the stock market accounted for 5% of the funding received by Japan's businesses, while in Germany, the stock market accounted for 8%. So why is the stock market less important than other sources of financing? The same data, taken from page 209 in Mishkin's book, tells us that bonds accounted for 32% of funding for American corporations. This data shows that bonds are a higher and more important source of funding. But even so, taking both stocks and bonds into consideration, that still leaves 53% of total American funding to a different source than stocks and bonds. So if stocks and bonds make up the total share of marketable securities, what supplies the U.S. with over 1/2 of the external funding received, and why don't the U.S. and other countries use marketable securities more intensely? Indirect finance is many times more important than direct finance. Indirect finance involves the activities of financial intermediaries, while direct finance is the sale of marketable securities directly to households. Even with 43% of external financial funding to U.S. corporations being through marketable trade, this piece of data greatly overstates the importance of direct funding in the financial system today. Since 1970, less than 5% of newly issued corporate bonds and less than 1/3 of stocks were sold directly or through direct finance to American households. The rest were bought up and sold through indirect finance by financial intermediaries. That means that less than 10% of external funding in the U.S. comes from direct finance. Can you imagine how even less important direct finance is to the rest of the world? As we saw earlier in the graph, the primary source of external funding to businesses around the world are loans. These loans are made by banks or other non-bank entities such as insurance companies, pension funds, and finance companies. It's easy to see that throughout the world, bank activities are the most important source of financing businesses everywhere. Banks play an even more important role in developing countries than they do in industrialized countries. The financial system is among the most heavily regulated sectors of the economy. The financial system is vital to the well-being and survival of the United States. Because of this, the government primarily regulates financial markets to promote the provision of information, and to ensure the stability of the system. This is true about financial systems and governments around the world. Only large, well-established corporations have easy access to securities markets to finance their activities. Smaller businesses and corporations are less likely to be able to raise funds by issuing stocks and bonds. Instead, they are more prone to obtain their financing from banks. This data perfectly supports the data from the previous graph and shows that loans, either from bank or other non-bank entities, play a more important role in external funding than the buying and selling of marketable securities. Collateral is a prevalent feature of debt contracts for both households and businesses. Collateral is property that is pledged to a lender to guarantee payment in the event that the borrower is unable to make debt payments. Collateral debt, also known as secured debt, is a primary form of household debt and is very common in business borrowing as well. Most of the household debt throughout the United States consists of collateralized debt. Debt contracts are extremely complicated legal documents that place substantial restrictive covenants on borrowers. Many students who enter into debt contracts or loans think them as a simple IOU, but in reality it is far different. In all countries, bond or loan contracts contain provisions, which are called restrictive covenants. These restrictive covenants contain rules that restrict the borrower and specify certain activities that the borrower can and cannot participate in. Transaction costs are a major problem in financial markets. Transaction costs, like the word promotes, are predetermined costs that must be paid when making a transaction. High transaction costs keep many American households from being able to buy marketable securities. Only about 1/2 of American households own any securities at all. Luckily for many households and people, financial intermediaries have evolved to reduce financial costs. This is done through economies of scale and expertise. Economies of scale is the reduction in transaction costs per dollar of investment as the size or scale of the transaction increases. This is achieved through bundling investors' funds together to reduce the overall transaction costs of each individual investor. Economies of scale exist today because the total cost of carrying out a transaction in most financial markets only increases by a small size or scale as the amount of the transaction grows. We discussed earlier that indirect finance makes up the majority percent of external funding. Because of economies of scale, financial intermediaries have developed and have become a very important part of our financial system. A common example of economies of scale is a mutual fund. A mutual fund is a financial intermediary that sells shares to individuals and then reinvests that money into stocks or bonds. The mutual fund will buy large portions of stocks or bonds at an advantage of a smaller transaction cost. Financial intermediaries have also developed an expertise that allows them to access lower transaction costs. Examples of these are check writing privileges on clients' accounts and toll-free numbers that clients can call to check on how their investments are doing at any moment. Expertise allows financial intermediaries to offer their customers liquidity services, which are services that allow customers to conduct transactions more easily. Moral hazard is a problem that occurs after a transaction has taken place. A seller of a share of marketable securities may have incentives or reasons to withhold certain information and/or engage in activities that are undesirable for the purchaser of the security. Equity contracts, such as common stock, are subject to moral hazard. This particular moral hazard is called the principal agent problem. This can occur often in a firm. Managers of a firm only own a small portion of the firm. It is the stockholders who own most of the firm's equity. The stockholders are called the principals. This makes the managers of the firm the agents of the owners or the stockholders. This separation in ownership and control can invite moral hazard because the managers of the firm may choose to act in their own interest and maximize their personal gain instead of acting solely for the benefit of the firm. Another form of moral hazard is through corporate strategy, where managers will try to further their personal power within a corporation without increasing the corporation's profitability, or putting little effort into doing so. Examples of moral hazard in today's financial system can be seen through companies such as Enron and Tyco International, in which managers were found to have directed corporate funds in such a way as to ensure personal gains while the company was placed in financial ruin. One way for stockholders to reduce moral hazards is to monitor the firm's activities by auditing the firm frequently and checking in on what management is doing. One of the problems that arises with the monitoring of the firm's activities through auditing is that it is quite expensive. Economists have given this activity the name of costly state verification because of how expensive it is to do. Government regulations have been set forth to force firms to adhere to standard accounting principles and to make profit verification easier. These laws impose stiff criminal penalties on people who commit fraud or try to hide and or steal profits. Catching this type of fraud is not easy, and managers who participate in fraudulent activities make it very hard for government agencies to find or prove fraud. Financial intermediaries have also become a very important part of our financial system because it has the ability to avoid some form of moral hazard. A venture capital firm is a financial intermediary that helps reduce moral hazards of the principal-agent problem. Venture capital companies pool together the resource of their partners and invest that money into startup businesses. Because verification of earnings and profits are so important, venture capital companies will often insist that their own people participate as members of the board of directors so that a close eye can be kept on the activities of the company. Thank you for listening to this presentation. I hope you have learned something new about financial structures and external financial funding to corporations and businesses around the world.